We'll give Mr. King till 22. Yeah. Oh, here we are. Here we are. Okay, so welcome Alex and Bashir. You have come from LGPS Central to give us an overview of the responsible investment strategy and engagement. So please carry on.
Thank you, Chair. First, thanks for having us today. Basically, what we're trying to do here today is to instill some new, if there's anything new from here, from what we're doing at LGPS Central to assist the members make decisions. As you know, the purpose of the committee is to set strategy and assess the risk management framework. If you look at the TCFD, that's basically what the committee is expected to do. And what we're trying to do here today is to give a little bit of background on what RINE means to us at LGPS Central, and what we do in-house at LGPS Central to help you with making those decisions, basically the metrics and the data that you can use to make your decisions. So Alex will do the bulk of the presentation today, and if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the time. I understand this will be a refresher for most of you, but since we're covering a lot of content, we will have time at the end for questions, but feel free to stop at any point. Obviously, if we're talking about a specific topic, it makes sense so we address any issues on it there and then. So if we move on to the next slide, yeah, this one. So this is just looking at the contents we're going to be covering today. So starting off looking at responsible investment, covering some topics such as what it actually means to us, how we view it and how we view RI in terms of financial outcomes. And then we're going to be moving on to looking at manager selection and manager monitoring, so the overall investment process. Beyond that, we're going to be having a look at stewardship. So largely talking about engagement as well as the stewardship themes and how we've picked them, as well as a couple of case studies from engagements we've had from this year, or the first half of this year, as well as looking at the most recent voting season. Finally, we're going to be talking broadly about a couple of RI issues which are key to LGPS Central as well to the industry as a whole. So looking at net zero commitments, the climate issues, as well as focusing on our climate risk monitoring service and some of the metrics that goes into that. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the TNFD. So for those who aren't aware, this is a more biodiversity focused sort of TCFD reporting that's now coming into play as the importance of biodiversity increases. Again, please stop me if I'm going too fast or if any topics aren't clear, and feel free to ask me any questions at any point. But we will make sure that these slides are distributed after, and you should also have our contact details if you have any further questions that we're not able to touch on. But if we make a start, is everything okay? Sorry. Yeah, okay. So if we Thank you very much. So yeah, moving on to our first topic, looking at responsible investment and what that actually means for LGPS Central. So we, by and large, view ESG risks as an input, where we want to make sure that we consider ESG factors as both at the investment decision process to go into the selection and then move into the monitoring. We very much consider it as an input. And we actually look at this from a financially material perspective. So RI integration should not be ethically motivated from our perspective, but rather we want to pick up the investment risks as you would with any other investment risks that can be financially material to the long term of the client's portfolio. And due to the fact, obviously, this can have real financial material risk to the portfolio, we do believe it's our fiduciary duty to make sure that we include these risks in the investment process. If we just move to the next slide. This is taking a look at how ESG can affect the market. So at the moment, there is a general consensus among academics that there is a relationship between financial performance and ESG performance. There's still a bit of an ongoing debate to determine the true nature of this relationship and how one will affect the other. But the easiest way to see it is, and the most obvious, and the one will make most of the headlines, is looking at it from a downside risk perspective. So you've pulled up a couple of examples. So the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, as well as the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. So a lot of times, these kind of risks represent areas where ESG risks haven't been considered properly, mitigations haven't been put in place, and they have had a long-term financially material detrimental impact to the company. And obviously, these are things which will be also affecting portfolios. So if we move on to the next slide. Just talking about what the objectives are for RINE in terms of LGPS Central. And as we mentioned, this comes from a financially material perspective. And considering that, our primary purpose is to support the investment objectives. And again, majority of that is looking at long-term value creation and mitigating investment risks. Beyond this, we have a secondary objective of being an exemplar with the RI space within the financial services industry. And at the moment, we're quite proud to say that we do feel like we're doing a relatively good job in this aspect. So recently, we've actually been shortlisted for the Best Approach to Responsible Investment at the LAP Awards, which is taking place next week. And we're proud to say at the moment, 100% of our products at launch and existing have had a RI integrated status, and we can touch on later what that actually means. So if we move on to the next slide. This is just to provide an overview of what the RINE function will do and what me and Basha and the rest of the team do at LGPS Central. So broadly speaking, there's 3 areas: selection. This is best thought of as the due diligence process that goes into the external managers to making sure that we are comfortable that RI risks are being considered at a satisfactory degree. So these risks can be mitigated and any opportunities can be taken advantage of. Moving on to stewardship, which we're going to talk about a lot later. This largely encompasses engagement, voting and advocacy, where advocacy largely represents where we believe there's issues with a framework or regulation, and we work with regulators to amend this to improve the framework in the interest of a best practice and for client protection of their portfolio. And finally, there's transparency and disclosure. So this is where we disclose to the market what we're doing, what climate metrics look like, what the data looks like, and also talking about themes such as stewardship. So most recently, we've actually been able to renew our participation as a signatory of the stewardship code, and we've recently completed our PRI reporting as well. So this is just areas where we can give evidence of the success of our engagement, as well as looking at RI metrics. So if we move on, and again, please stop me if I'm talking too fast or going too fast or anything like that. So we've already mentioned ESG already, but I think it's important to actually talk about what this means. So ESG being an acronym for environmental, social and governance, and these are largely the factors that we take into consideration when integrating RI into investment decisions. So in terms of environmental factors, this will include climate change, pollution and waste. And as we've mentioned already, there's a growing importance on biodiversity, and we'll have a chance to talk about that a little later on. Social, so this largely looks at the people around the business. So that can be the employees and how they're being treated, but also the people who are affected by the operations of the business and those who are affected by the products of the business. And then finally, governance. So this largely looks at corporate governance as well as the corporate behavior. Often this sometimes gets overlooked in terms of ESG and RI integration, but considering what's happened in the past year with Silicon Valley Bank, where a lot of people have pointed fingers saying the issue largely comes down to governance and poor corporate behaviour. It is clearly a major key issue, and it is something that should be incorporated into RI integration when considering ESG risks as well as opportunities. And again, as we've mentioned already, while we've spoke a lot about risks and downside area, we do think there are a lot of opportunities which can come from ESG. And when you look at businesses as a whole, you can often see areas of value creation considering ESG elements of their business. And why we like to use this nice, neat acronym, there is obviously a lot of overlap between ES and G, where you're looking at climate governance and how pollution can affect people nearby to the business's operations. So it is not as clear cut as it appears in this. So just moving on to the next slide, we wanted to briefly outline our responsible investment process. We will go into a bit more detail for public markets and private markets. But just to give a broad outline, this generally refers to the selection process, so looking at the due diligence of companies, understanding how they are incorporating ESG risks into their own investment processes. Appointment, so again, this is once we're happy with the process in place, making sure the managers who work on our behalf understand what our expectations are of them in terms of ESG risks. And then finally, the monitoring stage, which again will be just as we move down the line, making sure that these managers stay up to date with best practices, make sure nothing falls behind in terms of how they're understanding ESG risks, and making sure that they're staying on top of any new upcoming issues. So moving on to the next slide, we can just focus on manager selection. So while this will be different for certain asset classes, obviously there's inherent differences from one asset class to another, and also from one manager to another. We do believe that RI can be integrated into every asset class, and we do believe there is an appropriate level of RI integration for those asset classes, but that just means we have to take a more nuanced approach. So the 5 pillars we do consider in all selection is policy, people, process, performance, which largely looks at case studies of where they can actually show us that they've integrated RI&E rather than just showing us their policies and telling us they're doing it. We do like to see hard evidence in terms of case studies. And then transparency and collaboration, which is just ensuring that they're collaborating with industry best practices and also actually reporting on this with some sort of third-party verification, so we can actually say, is this something you're doing or is this something that you're telling us? So as I mentioned, broadly speaking, we will focus on these, but we do take a nuanced approach from manager to manager. We do actually get a score once we look at these. As you can see, we score the scoring system down there. So there's a GP score for private markets, and then we will put together an overall score. We really believe there is a no one size fits all kind of approach to this. So there is therefore no threshold cutoff on this scoring system. We just want to make sure that we believe RI has been integrated to a satisfactory degree. So moving on to manager monitoring. Yeah, all right, thank you. So this isn't just something that we think RI&E team should be focused on. We obviously want to take advantage of the expertise of the asset class experts at LGPS Central. So for the public markets, the active team and the fixed income team will have monthly meetings with the managers, at which point they can raise any financially material ESG risks they think appropriate. But we also take part in the monthly monitoring, where the RI&E team will sit down with the managers online, obviously. And at this point, we'll have a dedicated amount of time to ask them some questions on their RI processes. We can pick out a couple of the new companies they've integrated into the portfolio and ask if certain risk has been considered. And it just gives us a chance to sit down with the manager and make sure that they are still following best practices and integrating RI&E to a satisfactory level. Beyond this, we also have 3-year reviews. So recently this has taken place for the Global Equities Fund, the Emerging Markets Fund, and the Corporate Bonds Fund. So I had a large role within the Corporate Bonds Fund, so I thought we could focus on that in terms of what we actually look at. So there's a large focus on how the manager has changed over the past 3 years since we initially invested, and also chance to talk about the engagement they've conducted and what we expect of them. So just to give some examples around this and looking at corporate bonds. So we recently spoke with Neuberger Berman, one of the two managers within fixed income for the corporate bond fund. We were really impressed with the improvements they've made. We think that they have taken a really smart, nuanced approach to how they've improved RI&E. So rather than just improving their headcount to treat as a blunt instrument for RI&E, they've been clever with the kind of expertise they've brought in. They've had a really large focus on data, bringing in some data experts, particularly with a focus on ESG risks and ESG opportunities. And because of that, they've actually been able to improve the data they look at and the data they take into consideration with their investment process. They've also been able to give us some really strong examples of engagement where they've outlined what their initial objective is, and they've also been able to outline how this objective and how they've achieved this and how they've actually impacted the company and the industry through these objectives and through these engagements. And we've also seen a high level of disclosure from the managers. Fidelity, again, we've also seen that they have improved over the past 3 years. And it's key to note that we don't expect the same improvements to be seen from Fidelity to Neuberger Berman, as we don't expect from the initial selection process for them to have identical RI&E processes. We've seen Fidelity have taken a different approach. Again, they've been able to improve their headcount, and they've made some developments in terms of data coverage to ensure that RI&E can be taken into account for a wider range of assets. We did also highlight some issues that we thought with Fidelity, but the key reason we want to highlight this is the fact that Fidelity had been really open with us in terms of communication. So since we've highlighted these issues, we've had several communications with them to actually address these areas. So we're really happy with the communication that we've seen from Fidelity, as well as the improvements from both managers over the past 3 years. Moving on to private markets, obviously there's a different, more nuanced approach. And again, we do take advantage of the industry knowledge from the asset class experts we have in-house. So a lot of the time it will be the private market team talking with the managers, and this will happen on a 2-year basis and more if necessary, at which point they can bring up any relevant financing material RI topics. This will be from a risk-based approach, and I also want to highlight the fact that during our initial due diligence stage, we can highlight to the private market teams, or we think this issue needs addressing, or we want you to follow up on certain aspects of the business, and this is something they will follow up with the manager. Again, we want to highlight that we are currently reviewing our monitoring process and our internal RI policies regarding private markets. This is just mainly because we want to make sure that we keep up to date with industry best practices and make sure that RI is adequately integrated into our investment processes. So moving on to the next slide. So I know we've mentioned RI integrated status, but I just wanted to touch on what that actually means. So this is something that we would do during the initial selection process, during the due diligence. And this basically means that we are comfortable that the managers are integrating RI&E to their investment process to a satisfactory level. And at the moment, for all of our existing product launches and existing products, we're happy to say that we are happy with the level that all of our managers have integrated RI&E. And again, we just want to highlight this is a no one size fits all, and we do expect different managers to take different approaches. So moving on to the topic of stewardship, and we want to talk about what stewardship actually means to us. So stewardship refers to the oversight of capital in the interest of long-term value for our clients. So just want to touch on engagement in a lot more detail. So through engagement, that will also encompass voting as well as escalation. And we also want to highlight some of the escalation avenues we have in place for engagement. So as you can see from the graphic in the bottom right, moving from left to right, you have the various escalations we can have with with the companies. So starting off, you can have just a simple meeting with them to highlight some of the issues, and this can be through simply us with the company where there's an existing relationship in place, or this can be part of a collaboration process where we talk to other shareholders and other managers. If we feel like our issues aren't being heard, or if we think the business or the company isn't taking into consideration our feedback, we can escalate this to voting. So we can vote we can vote for shareholder resolutions, or we can vote against directors who are chairs of certain committees where we feel like ESG isn't being taken into consideration to a high enough level. And again, if we want to escalate further, this could look like making public statements, putting forward shareholder resolutions ourselves, and at the final stage, litigation or divestment. That being said, while we do think divestment can be part of engagement, we do want to highlight that we do believe engagement is more compatible with our fiduciary duty, and we do believe it leads to better outcomes for all stakeholders. And we are going to touch on a bit more why we believe that is the case in the coming slide. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So our main reasoning for supporting engagement is the fact that this allows us to have a seat at the table when we talk to companies and when we want to steer the companies in a direction that we believe best suits our clients' beliefs, so we can steer the company in terms of so we can make sure the companies align their values with our clients' beliefs, but it also means that we can get the company to act in the best interest that will protect long-term financial value. So obviously there is always an argument in terms of divestment, so we kind of want to touch on why we believe engagement is the better approach versus divestment. And the main argument here is the fact that we will lose influence over the company. And this could also then lead to the fact that if we divest, we could be handing these assets over to less responsible investors who are happy to hold these high emitting companies. They're not too concerned with the ESG credentials, and they might not have much of an interest in terms of reducing emissions of the companies or improving ESG credentials in other aspects. So if we move on to the next slide, we've just grabbed a couple of case studies. Did you want to jump in, sorry, Bastian?
You move to the next slide if you want to talk about engagement versus divestment. Next one. Yeah, this slide is very important because it explains the relationship between how our portfolio affects the climate and also how the climate affects the portfolio. So it's a two-way relationship, it's not just one. Yes, if you divest, you may not affect the climate as much as if you are invested in these companies, but you have to remember these companies, they affect the environment, and the environment then affects your portfolio back. So the outcome that we're looking for is not just a cleaner portfolio. The outcome that we're looking for is a world that is orderly transitioning into net zero. And that's why we think having a seat on the table and really engaging and pushing these companies, the worst of the worst emitters in the world, to set a strategy to get to net zero by 2050 is the way forward. I understand the progress have been relatively slow. I think a lot of people want to see a lot more progress, but it's a complex issue. You can't really. The reality is that we've only been engaging on this topic over the past 5 years-ish. CA100 was only 3 years. 3 years ago only was started 3 years ago. So CA100, Climate Action 100, is the largest engagement group for climate. Started 3 years ago. I don't think, yes, I agree that the progress has been relatively slow, but if we are not doing anything, then it's going to be even worse. Today, what I see is that a lot of these worst emitters, the Glencores, the Shells, the BPs of this world, they have published a net zero strategy. Whether or not these strategies are up to par, that's another matter altogether, but at least there is a step towards the right direction, and it's up to us as engagers to actually sit down with them, analyze this strategy, and tell them whether we think it's good enough to get us to net zero. So we still think this is the right way to do it. I don't think we're going to change our views at all about engagement versus divestment. And if you go to the previous slide, slide number 17, these are some of the examples where companies divest from their dirtiest assets, and the assets go into the hands of investors who do not really care about climate change. And as I said, when this happens, Anglo-American spin-off Thungela, the South African coal, pure thermal coal company, is a prime example of this. When they were owned by Anglo-American, the investors at CA100 actually engaged with Anglo-American and asked them about their plans to go to net zero for this particular assets. They spun it off, and Thungela is not in any of CA100 or any engagement groups that I can think of. So I don't know whether or not this company is actually really trying to go to net zero, and that's where I think divestment can be the wrong thing to do. Sorry, Alex.
No, thank you. If we just go back one slide again, we just want to add to one other colour as well to this. There is also the fact that some of these companies which are high emitters at the moment, they do have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of resources in place for, in the net transition world, they can be leaders in this area. That was it, sorry. So moving on away from engagement and looking, well, still on stewardship, just want to talk about how we actually select our stewardship themes. So currently on our stewardship themes, we have climate change, plastic pollution, responsible tax behaviour, and human rights risks. And as you can see from the three categories, this is how we actually determine what we think these stewardship themes should be. So considering the economic relevance, this looks at the financial materiality in relevance to the portfolio. So we will consider how much of a significant risk is this to the portfolio, and also how exposed is the portfolio to these risks. Stakeholder relevance is in the consideration of what our stakeholders, so our partner funds, what areas they think are most concerning. A lot of the time there will be a lot of overlap between economic relevance and stakeholder relevance, as you can imagine. And then finally is looking at our ability to leverage collaboration. So why we might understand that these areas pose the largest financial risks. It is also worth to take into consideration how much of an impact can we make on these areas. So this will be taken in consideration with what access do we have to collaboration groups, what existing relationship do we already have in place, and just by and large, how much of an impact and how much of an influence do we believe we can have in these areas. So go ahead.
Yeah, the next few slides are examples, so the committee can probably go through this at their own leisure. So let's just skip all the way to slide number 27, which is the stewardship code. If any of the members are interested in what LGPS Central does when it comes to stewardship, our stewardship report is a treasure trove of case studies and examples of the efforts that the team here at LGPS Central does. So I would highly encourage the members to actually read this at their own leisure and get up to speed to what LGPS Central is doing. Yeah, let's just move to the next few slides. The next slide is just a divider. Yeah, the next one on net zero commitment. LGPS Central our board has just approved our net zero strategy. We've made our ambitions clear last year that we want to be net zero by 2050. And our board has approved our net zero strategy early this week, and we will be publishing it. And we already shared it to your pensions officers. and we will be publishing it to on our website sometime next week. And ultimately, the idea is, again, the goal is the goal is to get the world to move to an orderly transition by 2050. The goal is not just for us to have a clean portfolio. If you want us to have a clean portfolio, it's very easy. You can just divest everything, but that does not meet the goal, the objective of our net zero strategy. And there's a lot of hard work still to be done. We're quite far away from reaching our target, but having this strategy at least gives us the mindset or the goal or the track to get there by 2050. Next slide is on our climate risk monitoring service. Again, you've seen this slide before. These are some of the services that we do for you. The main one is probably the climate risk report. The reason why we do all these things is, if you look at it from the bottom-up perspective, when we do our metrics, it's basically just identifying where the risks are. And then when we identify those risks, we go to our monitoring, our manager monitoring. That's our assessing whether or not these risks are being managed by the managers that we appoint. And then moving on to stewardship, that's basically how we manage those risks in-house. So if you look at the risk management framework, we identify by doing some bottom-up analysis on the portfolios. We manage, we assess by speaking to managers and really understanding how they manage it. And then we manage it again ourselves by stewarding and by engaging with all these companies, and hopefully reduce the overall risk to our portfolio. The next slide is just an illustration of the climate risk monitoring service. We go through this when we publish our next climate risk report. Just rest assured, we are adding new metrics in there. We have an eye on the Department of Levelling Up's consultation last year on the metrics that they asked for. They asked for basically finance emission, they asked for normalized finance emission, data quality, and Paris alignment, and we are addressing those metrics in our next climate risk report. And again, we are actively engaging with others in the industry to figure out whether there's any new metrics that we need to deliver to the members in our future iteration. So a lot of these next few slides are what you will see when we present our climate risk report. Not sure when, but later this year perhaps. So you'll see it later. The last slide that we want to present is slide number 37 on the TNFD. I guess I'll pass this back to you, Alex.
Thank you. So as we mentioned before, there's a increasingly growing interest in the importance of biodiversity, and there is a thought as well that at the moment a lot of companies and a lot of financial institutions aren't truly understanding the impact that they have on them in terms of their financial performance. So this is something that the TNFD is looking to target. So the key area to this is to consider the financial materiality of this, and as of 2020, over 50% of global GDP was moderately or highly dependent on nature. We also want to highlight the fact that the risks from nature do fall hand in hand with climate risk, so they are compounded one to the other. So if you consider the fact that a lot of these rainforests and some of the ocean will act as these natural carbon captures, as these forests get taken down, we then lose a lot of our capacity for carbon capture, which only intensifies the emissions being released from carbon intensive companies. And just to highlight the process of the TNFD at the moment, it's nearing the end of its 2-year development framework phase, and we expect later this month a published market adaptation of this. Unless there's anything else Bashar wants to cover?
Yeah, on the TNFD, we'll use it the same way we use the TCFD, basically. Data metrics is bottom-up analysis of the risk within the portfolios, and then we'll assess it, we identify it, we try to manage it, and then we will advise our partner funds on how to govern this risk and what they should advise their committees on how on what to do on the strategies, whether or not we need to include it in our ISS, FSS, and have a separate nature strategy. That's another matter altogether. So when the time comes and we have more understanding of what is required of us, we will get back to the partner funds and also to the committee at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's everything we wanted to share with you today.
Thanks very much, Alex and Bashar. Now, any comments, queries? Scott, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well presented and very beneficial for me to see those slides. A couple of questions, if I may, Chair. I want to go back to the governance, which you lightly touched upon. It's not a criticism. It's because it's the hardest area to control, especially you're not running these companies. You have an influence about whether we invest in them or not, or you invest in them or not, but you don't have direct control over them. So where my topic is going, and you use two great examples, Volkswagen and the oil spill. So whenever you're invested in anybody, you can do all the due diligence and it's impressive what you do. And I'm not making any criticism whatsoever. But ultimately, because you don't have direct control over these people, there are three areas of concern. And that is accidental damage, because the world's not perfect and accidents happen. That's why we have insurance. There's negligence, which can potentially be avoided because a negligent process is in place, but it wasn't malicious. And then there's deliberate. And the reason why I use those three themes is because if we take the oil spill, then potentially there was negligence. Potentially, it certainly wasn't deliberate. They wanted to spill their precious asset. But using then the VW example, somebody signed off, somebody at senior level somewhere signed off the diesel cheating software. And that has a direct consequence, massive. In every VW company, it doesn't matter whether it's Porsche or it's VW or it's Lamborghini, anyone who's associated with VW and their associated component manufacturers are affected by that massive decision. So somebody in a big room somewhere made a critical decision that was going to affect the value of the company. So that's why I'm structuring the question that way. So what happens, because no matter what due diligence you do, and it's not a criticism of yourselves, when it goes wrong. So in the VW example, if it goes wrong because of an accident, that's fundamentally different to if it goes wrong because of corporate stupidity. Because, I mean, you'd never sign up to a director saying, let's cheat the customer. That was my first bit. So what happens when it goes wrong? And second bit, and this is observational and not critical. Can we go back to your slide about your phases? Your slides are so good. I've just thought of a point on your phases slide, which is just feedback that you may or may not want to take on board. So you've got phase 1 to 5 there. Great, thank you. Yes. You've been so honest in all the other stuff, it just stands out a million miles to me. Your phase 1 to 5, the borders on that are exactly the same green all the way through, as if the world's perfect now. And you're not saying that in any of your other stuff. So it's just feedback. If they were tabled a light or darker green or purple phasing through to green to being showing a trajectory around the border, it would look more impressive than it does now. You may agree or disagree, but that's my feedback, Chair.
We'll take that on board. We can think about that. The one thing to note about the phases here is that we use phases of implementation on different asset classes. So we know that if you look at public equities, we're already on phase 4, perhaps on phase 5. But if you go back to our private market investments, a lot of it is still in phase 1. So this is how we monitor the progress of our net zero strategy. We want to make sure that all of our assets under management move towards phase 5, obviously. So there's a lot of hard work to be done. On the governance, I agree with you. Governance is probably the most important thing. And if governance are right at VW, at BP, then the disaster will not happen. it is very difficult to assess governance. We don't really have the right metrics. For us, the way we assess governance is to make sure that managers really do know the investments that they make. And every once in a while, we do ask them about, okay, talk about this company, who are on the board, how do you assess the ability of the board to make the right decisions, whether or not this board is fit for the companies that they invest in. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to be very, very difficult to do because, again, not everybody publishes their CV online, and not everyone can actually sit down on the board and become and sit in the REMCO and make decisions on whether or not this board member is the right one to appoint. But we are getting a little bit more understanding of what the right composition of the board is. Sometimes the board that are so big, it's also not the right board to have. So we are engaging, and one of the things that we do every year is, and when we vote, we do assess the boards that we vote on. And the FRC is going to come up with a new corporate governance code next year or early end of this year, and we have an input on board responsibilities and also board fitness of the boards that are on these companies. And yeah, going forward, we are trying to find better ways to assess the governance of the companies that we invest in. But just like the phases probably in phase 1.
Thanks, Mr. Cartwright, and thanks for the response there. Has anyone else got any other queries or questions? Nick?
Just one really an observation relating to governance is that where I found where it's been good is where the senior manager has been willing to accept bad news. It's where they won't accept bad news is where things that then get covered up.
That's right. I think if you look at some of the annual reports that we read, and there are discussions on strategy, some of the best disclosures I see is when the company actually admits, okay, we set this strategy, it didn't work. Now we want to do this. So when boards and management are open with shareholders, that makes our lives much easier. And I think you're right, when they're more transparent, they don't have anything to hide. There's a sign that the board is actually doing something right there.
Has anybody else got any queries? Yeah, Roy.
Just a point on governance again. Companies have to have independent directors. It's worth looking to see how many independent directorships those people have, because there's a lot of people around who just fill those seats. And if they're on about 25 boards, they patently can't do a very effective job. So that's one way you can delve a little deeper.
Yep, we do look at overboarding. We do vote against board members who are in too many boards or too many board committees. There's also a little bit of a problem because right now we also ask companies to have a balance or a balanced board when it comes to diversity. And a lot of companies did say to us, the feedback we got was there's not enough female candidates to fill in this board. And as you can see, the problem here then, the same female board members in 9-10 boards, and that's not good. So the idea is, yep, there is a problem here today, but we need to, train the next cohort of board members from both genders or any community to be up there, to be good enough to be in boards.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's certainly not a perfect world, but I mean, to be honest, we're moving the right way. And dishonesty, which is clearly what happened with VW, is something that is really difficult to overcome because people were deliberately and directly misled, which is really problematic. So we have no other questions. Thank you very much, Alex and Basar, for coming in today for a comprehensive a report, which is has brought forward quite a few questions. And I think what we've learned today is that we can't solve the problems of the world, and neither can you, but we can move in the right direction. Okay, thank you everybody for staying for the training, and we'll see you again on the 1st of December at 9:30.